It's early in the morning. The sky over Jerusalem still carries the dark weight of night, but the streets are already breathing. You're standing in a city that never quite sleeps, especially not this time of year. The chill of Mediterranean spring touches your face as you walk down a narrow limestone alley, and the smell coming from all directions is a mixture impossible to separate. Wood smoke, specialties, human sweat, and something warm and alive animal, or old, thousands of them. You are in Jerusalem in the year 33 after Christ, and the city is about to explode. Not of violence, not yet, but of people. It is estimated that at this time of year, the population of Jerusalem is normally between 50,000 and 80,000 inhabitants. It even tripled or even quadrupled during the Jewish Passover festival. Despite this, pilgrims from all parts of the Mediterranean world came on foot, on donkeys, in caravans, crossing deserts and mountains for entire weeks to be here, in this city, in this specific week. Galileans of the north, Jews of Babylon, traders of Egypt, entire families of Syria, all with a single destination, the temple. But what exactly was going on here? What these people did, ate, felt, feared. What it was like to experience Easter in Jerusalem in the same year that, according to the Gospels, Jesus of Nazareth was crucified and resurrected, the answer will surprise you. Because biblical Easter was nothing like what most of us imagine today. Forget for a moment the soft images of Renaissance paintings, the serene golden beaded tables and white somber bread. What was happening in Jerusalem that week was something radically more raw, more physical, more disturbing. And at the same time, more profoundly the year than any artistic representation has managed to capture. It was a feast of memory and blood, of liberation and sacrifice, of collective joy and individual fear. It was all of that at the same time. Let's start at the beginning, which actually starts long before you arrive in the city. If you were a Jewish pilgrim coming from Galilee, the region where Jesus and most of his disciples were from, you would have walked about 140 kilometers on foot, 3, for sometimes 5 days of marching. You would carry on your back, or on an animal, a bundle with supplies, extra clothes and most likely a lamb. A young male lamb without blemish, which you would have chosen carefully 10 days before the feast. Exactly as Lady Moises determined in the book of study. This animal walked beside you, slept next to you, ate what you had. And then, on the afternoon of the 14th of the month of Nisan, you would hand him over to the priest to be sacrificed. Think about it for a moment, 10 days with the animal you chose, 10 days looking at it, taking care of it. And then, the delivery, that wasn't the insensitivity. It was the opposite, it was the central point of the party, the awareness of the cost of freedom. The living memory, that on the last night in Egypt more than 1,000 years before that moment, each family and Brea had painted their doorposts with the blood of a lamb so that the angel of death would pass over them. A Pasco, it was not an absent celebration. It was an annual survival quest. And the city knew it. As you approached Jerusalem for the last few kilometers of the road, something visual hit you hard. The city walls, reducing to the afternoon. Built with white Pedro limestone, which the Romans called Malak. And at the center of it all, dominating the horizon with a presence that is almost impossible to ignore, the Temple of Herodes. Not the small temple and mildy that many imagine. An architectural complex that the Romans themselves considered one of the wonders of the ancient world, its external stones measured, some of them, more than 12 meters in length, and weighed hundreds of tons. The main facade was covered in gold. And in the clear morning, when the sun rose over the mount of olive trees in the east, the reflection was so intense that, according to historian Flavio Josepho, anyone who tried to look directly at him had to look away as if they were looking at the sun. You arrived in this city carrying a lamb, and the city returned this image. Inside the walls, the organized chaos of an infested metropolis took over every inch. In the streets of the lower market, traders sold everything a pilgrim needed. Olive oil, bitter herbs such as horseradish and wild endive, unleavened flour for bread, wine. There were money changers on every corner, because the temple fee had to be paid in specific currency. The shooting cycle, and those who came from outside, brought Roman denarios, or Greek drachmas that needed to be exchanged. This was exactly the scene that the Gospels describe, when Jesus enters the temple, and you will come to the tables of the money changers a few days before your death. What seems like an isolated gesture of anger was, in fact, a gesture against the economic heart of the entire party. But there was something even more impactful, waiting for you in the temple courtyard. You pass through the gate and enter the outer court of the temple, called the court of the Gentiles, and what your senses receive all at once is almost unbearable: sound, smell, movement. No need for priests dressed in white, they move with absolute precision between marble pillars. Levites sing psalms aloud, the so-called Hallel, which are the psalms from 113 to 118, and the sound of their voices, through the stone walls, and into the warm afternoon air. There were harps, flutes, silver horns, it was music, but music with a quality you had never heard before nowhere else in the world, because no other place in the world was that, and there was blood. Not metaphorically. On the 14th day of Nisan, between mid-afternoon and sunset, the priests sacrificed the lambs brought by the pilgrims, in a ritual that Flavio Josepho describes with almost disturbing precision. According to him, in the year 70 after Christ, shortly before the destruction of the temple, more than 256,500 lambs were sacrificed in a single piece. Even if this number is exaggerated, as some historians suspect, the scale was colossal. The priests worked in shifts, groups checking in as others left. The blood was collected in covered, silver-plated containers, passed from hand to hand, in a human chain, up to the central altar, where it was spilled at the base. There were stone channels under the courtyard built specifically to drain the blood to the valid cedro below. This is what was happening in the same courtyard, where days before Jesus had taught multitudes. In the same temple, where according to Luke, he had been presented as a baby decades ago. Easter was not the backdrop of the story. Easter was the story, and now comes the part that changes everything. I thought about how Jesus' disciples were feeling that week. They were Galileans, countrymen, fishermen and artisans, who had arrived in Jerusalem along with the crowd of pilgrims. For most of them, it was probably one of the few times in their lives that they were in the capital. The city was bigger, louder, more Roman, and more intimidating than anything they knew. And his master had just made a public entrance that shook the entire city. The entry into Jerusalem on a donkey that all four Gospels describe was not a humble and unnoticed gesture as it is sometimes portrayed. It was a calculated political and religious declaration, because the prophet Zechariah had written centuries before that Israel would enter Jerusalem riding on a donkey, lame and bringing salvation. Anyone who knew the scriptures, and in Jerusalem at the time of the play, practically everyone knew them, immediately understood what it meant. The crowd spread cloaks on the ground and waved palm branches, a gesture that in Jewish culture was reserved for kings and liberators. They shouted, Hosanna, which literally means save now, a word loaded with political and messianic expectation. The Roman soldiers stationed in the Torontonia, strategically built high above part of the temple so that the soldiers could observe everything from above and intervene quickly in the event of a riot. Exactly during the play, when the risk of revolt was highest, these soldiers looked down and saw it all. And they took note. Rome had a relationship with the Jewish Passover that was pure calculated attention. The Roman governor normally lived in Caesarea Maritime, at Baramer, but during the Passover, he moved to Jerusalem. Not out of devotion, but out of caution. Pilate, the governor in the year 33, followed this same pattern. He was in the city, his soldiers were in the city, and he knew that the festival that the Jews celebrated was precisely a festival of liberation from the oppression of a foreign empire. Egypt was the past, Rome was the present. This analogy was not lost on anyone. It is in this context that Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples needs to be understood. The meal we know as the Last Supper was a yield, the ritual meal of the peace, and the yield had an ancient structure, a script that each Jewish family followed to the letter. There were 4 charges of wine, each representing one of the 4 promises of liberation that God had made to the people in Egypt, according to the Book of Study. There was unleavened bread, matzah, a symbol of the rush to escape, because there was no time to wait for the bread to rise. There was bitter zervis, maror, to remember the bitterness of slavery. There was the rare seven, a fruit and nut paste that represented the clay that the Hebrews used to build the cities of Egypt with their hands. Avia the lamb, who in that context was the center of everything, the father of the family or the leader of the table, led the ritual answering the youngest son's questions. The question was always the same, and the Jews ask it to this day, because this night is different from all other nights, and the answer was the entire narrative of the study, told anew, lived anew, felt anew. Jesus was doing just that with his 12 disciples, but on that particular night he changed the script. When the 3rd vase of wine arrived, the so-called vase of redemption, he said words that none of those present had heard before. He took the unleavened bread and said it was his body. He lifted the vase and said it was his blood, the blood of a new covenant, for men who had spent their entire lives hearing that the blood of the Paschal Lamb was the sign of liberation, listening to their master and repositioning that symbolism with reference just like that, was something that words can hardly describe. It was confusing, it was scary, it was impossible to fully understand at that moment. And then, Judas left the table, and the night began to move towards something that no one there could yet see clearly. The night from Thursday to Friday in that year 33 was the longest that Jesus' disciples ever lived. After the Sia, they went out through the city gate and went down to the Cedar Valley, then went up to the Mount of Olives, to a place called Gethsemane, which, in Aramaic, means oil press. It was a garden with ancient olive trees, twisted by time, and it was a place Jesus regularly frequented, meaning Judas knew exactly where to find him. You need to visualize this moment carefully to understand the weight of what was happening. It was the night of Lucia. The Jewish calendar is lunar, and the play always begins on Luakia in the month of Nisan, which means that Gethsemane's garden was bathed in a pale, cold light, that let the shadows of the olive trees fall on the dirt floor like figures of atadas. Jesus walked away from the disciples and went to pray. The Gospels describe his sweat falling as drops of blood, a condition that modern medicine identifies as hematidrosis. A real phenomenon that can occur in states of extreme distress, when the capillaries surrounding the sweat glands rupture under intense emotional pressure. He knew what was coming and chose to stay. When the soldiers arrived with Judas, with torches and spears, the number was considerable. John speaks of a court, which technically would be about 600 men, although many scholars understand that the term was used more loosely to indicate a significant detachment. The fact is that Jesus' arrest was not discreet. It was a night security operation, coordinated between the temple authorities and the Roman garrison exactly at the height of the most sensitive week of the year. When the Jaros beyond was clogged with pilgrims and any spark could turn into a blessing. Peter drew a sword and cut off the ear of one of the high priest's servants. Jesus attacked and restored her. And then, he gave in. The trial that followed, or rather, the trials, because there were several in quick succession, is one of the most studied events in ancient legal history. First before Annas, the former high priest who still held enormous political power. After ancient times, the high priest in office, where the Sanhedrin was gathered at dawn. Which in itself was a serious irregularity according to Jewish laws themselves, which prohibited night trials in cases of capital punishment. After Pilate sent it to Herodes Antipas, ruler of Galilee, who also happened to be in Jaros beyond to ask for it, and who returned it to Apolate. All this happened between dawn and morning. This frenetic pace was no accident. It was deliberate urgency. The religious leaders who wanted Jesus dead knew they had a narrow window. If the execution did not take place before the official start of the play, before sunrise that Friday, she would have to wait, and a wait meant time for the crowd of pilgrims, who worshipped Jesus as a prophet, to react, time for turmoil, time for Rome. I intervene in unpredictable ways. Pilate hesitated. The Gospels are consistent in this. He tried to escape the problem by using the custom of freeing a prisoner during the play, offering the choice between Jesus and Barabbas, described as an insurrectionist and murderer. The crowd chose Barabbas. This is where the narrative demands that we stop for a moment and resist the temptation to romanticize. The crowd that shouted the Hosanna at the triumphal entry, a few days before, it was made up mostly of Galilean pilgrims, who had arrived with Jesus or because of Jesus. The crowd before Pilate's praetorium that morning was different. It was summoned, it was local, it was influenced by the religious leaders who had the power and the means to mobilize their supporters quickly. It was not the same group that changed its mind. It was another group, in another place, at another time. The story is more complex than the simplified narrative of an inconsistent mob. The crucifixion took place in a place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull, outside the city walls. Death by crucifixion was the Roman punishment for non-Roman slaves and criminals, specifically designed to be slow, public, and humiliating. It was a permanent warning installed on the roads and around the city. Thus Rome treats those who challenged it to the disciples. Seeing your master die in this way was not only emotionally devastating, it was theologically disconcerting, because in Jewish tradition, someone hanging from a tree was considered cursed by God. Paul of Tarsus, years later, would quote exactly this verse from Deuteronomy, when trying to explain the meaning of Jesus' death. And then the third day arrived. What the Gospels describe on Sunday morning is a scene of confusion gradually transformed into amazement. The women, Maria Maddalena, Maria Mande Tiago, Salome and others, arrived at the tomb with aromatic specialties to complete the health of the body, because on the previous Friday, there had been insufficient time before the beginning of the Shabbat. They arrived expecting to find a corpse. They found a stone removed and an empty tomb. The resurrection, regardless of how each reader interprets it, whether as a literal historical event, a transformative spiritual experience, or a profound theological narrative, changed the world in a way that very few events in human history have been able to match. In less than 3 centuries, the festival that took place that Easter week in Jerusalem had spread throughout the Roman Empire, reaching Africa, Asia, and the borders of India. A message in the city in a garden of olive trees illuminated by the full moon, at the height of a liberation celebration with 2,000 years of history, carried by men and women who, for the most part, were poor, without political power, without armies. It came to you at this exact moment, 2,000 years later. Think about this distance, think about this persistence. What the Bible teaches us, looked at with open and honest eyes, goes far beyond religion. She tells us about collective memory as a survival tool, about how people who experience oppression, build on rituals to not forget where they came from and where they want to go, about how a simple meal, unleavened bread, bitter herbs, a glass of wine, can carry the weight of an entire identity for millennia. As liberation narratives have a power of resonance that transcends culture, language, and time, and teaches us something subtler, more disturbing, and more necessary, that history-changing moments seem monumental while they are happening. For those in Jerusalem that week, there was a noisy celebration, a regional preacher being executed, Roman soldiers maintaining order, pilgrims returning home with their burdens on their backs, and the memory of the lamb that had been betrayed. Everyday life progressed. History was being made in silence, in gardens, in tombs, in conversations, whispered among frightened fishermen who tried to understand what they had seen. You and I, we are always within moments that we still don't know how to name, always within a week that could be, for someone up front, the point at which everything changed. If this documentary touched you in any way, leave your comment below, write what surprised you most about this story. Like the video so that more people can learn about this content, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next documentaries. And if you want to continue on this journey through the ancient world, watch our video now about what everyday life was like in Jerusalem in Roman times. You won't be able to stop in the middle.